Today will be the second part of our discussion on learning and memory. Particularly today, we're going to be looking at how these principles can be applied in our lives. We're also going to take a look at our beliefs or our mindsets and how they affect how we learn. With advancements in neuroscience and educational psychology, we are learning more and more about how people learn. Go ahead and take a look at these 4 common beliefs. Are they fact or myth? The third bullet down is actually true. The rest are myths. Our brains do continue to develop and grow into adulthood. Our brain is not as simple as we used to assume. It changes throughout our lives, the biggest changes being between birth and about 25 or 26 years old. So in direct contrast of what we used to believe, that we were born with all the neurons in our brain that we would have for our lifetime, our brain actually develops and changes greatly through our lives. Why does it matter whether we know these are fact or myth? As you'll see shortly, our beliefs have a lot to do with how we learn. These 2 statements represent 2 different beliefs. Take a minute to pause your video and see which one you agree with more. We now know that the statement on the right that says that intelligence is changeable or malleable is the truer statement of the 2. Our intelligence can actually be developed and affected greatly by our efforts. According to Dr. Carol Dweck, these 2 statements represent 2 different mindsets. The statement on the left represents a fixed mindset because it says intelligence cannot be changed and is not very malleable. The statement on the right, which says that intelligence can actually be changed, is called a growth mindset. A person who has a fixed mindset is going to behave very differently from someone who has a growth mindset. Next, we'll take a look at how these 2 different mindsets motivate people to behave in very different ways, especially when it comes to learning. This graphic is a much more detailed depiction of the growth versus fixed mindset. Again, the fixed mindset is on the left and the growth mindset is on the right. Let's take a closer look at the fixed mindset first. You can see here that when a person has a fixed mindset, that is, that they believe that intelligence is fixed or static, it really leads to a desire to look smart, to prove to others that they've got it. Because ultimately, when we have a fixed mindset, we believe that either we've got it or we don't. We were born with it or we'll never have it. Because the motivation here is to prove to everyone else that they were born with whatever it is, that they've got it, that they're fast enough, that they're smart enough, that they're agile enough, capable enough, or creative enough. They will avoid challenges because any failure is going to be evidence that they may not have as much smarts or as much intelligence or be as fast or be as creative as they want others to believe they are. Those with a fixed mindset also believe that if something is really difficult, it probably means that it's too hard for them, and they'll give up very easily. They don't persist through obstacles because ultimately their effort is seen as fruitless. If you've either got it or you don't, you shouldn't have to put hard work into anything. If you have to work hard, then it must mean you're not smart enough. Because of these beliefs, someone with a fixed mindset is not going to take negative feedback or any type of criticism very well. They see these as insults, as someone pointing out their shortcomings, or how, according to their own beliefs, they're not able to do what it is they set out to do. Ultimately, anyone else who's successful is threatening to someone with a fixed mindset. They see other people's success as evidence that that person is smarter, faster, more intelligent, more creative, more capable than they are themselves. It's a competition. If we're born with what we're born with, then I want to prove that I was born with more than you. I want to prove that I'm smarter, that I'm faster, that I'm more capable. As a result of these beliefs and this behavior, those with a fixed mindset tend to plateau very early and not achieve their full potential. It's a very deterministic view of the world. There's not a lot of control over their intelligence because they believe it's not changeable. On the other hand, a person with a growth mindset isn't out to prove to others that they're smarter or faster. The focus here is not on proving to anyone at all. The focus is on the actual learning. Because of this, a person with a growth mindset embraces challenges. They know that something that is more challenging for them is going to help them to grow and develop. is going to help them to become more creative, more intelligent, more capable than they previously were. Because of this, those of us with a growth mindset tend to persist in the face of setbacks. They know that the obstacles are something that can be overcome, and they believe with enough effort and attention that this obstacle will help them to grow and develop and change their intelligence for the better. Because of these beliefs, a person with a growth mindset is actually very willing to take negative feedback or any criticism, as long as it's constructive, of course, because they see this as a way to help them improve. They see the negative feedback that they get as a way to know where their targeted efforts should be. In addition to this, they also find inspiration in the success of others, because they believe that if other people can do it, well, so can they. Our efforts impact how intelligent we are. As a result of these beliefs and behavior, those of us with a growth mindset tend to reach ever higher levels of achievement. There's never a point where a person with a growth mindset says, I'm done, I've made it, I've hit my peak. To someone with a growth mindset, there is no peak. You're always looking to improve. The focus is not on proving to others how intelligent they are, but on mastery of whatever skill or concept or learning the person is trying to master. So as we compare the two, it's very important to realize a couple of things. Number one, a key difference between the fixed and growth mindset is their perspective on effort. Those with a fixed mindset see effort as being very fruitless, as opposed to someone with a growth mindset who knows there are no results without effort. Number two, someone with a fixed mindset is very motivated to prove to others that they are more capable, more intelligent than everyone else. As opposed to people with a growth mindset, their focus is not to prove anything to others at all, but they're focused on their own mastery, on their own learning, and improving what it is they set out to learn. Lastly, it's very important to understand that even though we know that our intelligence as humans is changeable, and we can get results with effort, it's not only important to know it, but we actually have to believe it to have any impact on how it is that we develop as learners. So what do these mindsets look like in real life? Let's take a look at a couple of athletes to see how this plays out in the real world. You might recognize his face. This is John McEnroe. He was a tennis player, very famous in the 80s. Although he was a great tennis player, that wasn't really what he was most famous for. He was really well known for throwing huge tantrums on the tennis court, screaming at referees, letting them know that they're making mistakes. If you look at the couple of quotes that he has here, you might be able to guess why. What do you think? Fixed or growth? It's pretty much written on the wall or the PowerPoint. This is definitely what a fixed mindset looks like in real life. He says, my greatest strength is that I have no weaknesses. This is a person who was very focused on proving himself to others, on proving that he was born with it. In fact, and this is not a direct quote, he was also heard saying, why do I need to practice 99 times when I can just show up once and win? John McEnroe was a great tennis player, but he didn't meet his full potential. He was much more focused on proving to others just how great he was. But when he did encounter failure, this is where things got a little bit rocky for him. Now, he was great, according to himself, so failure wasn't something that was in his vocabulary. If, for some reason, he did encounter something that looked like failure, it was absolutely anyone else's fault but his. He was famous for blaming his own mistakes at things like the referee's bad calls, the sun was in his eyes, there was an attractive woman in the audience was too loud, or maybe he just didn't feel like winning that day. Ultimately, it's obvious from John McEnroe's behavior that he believes his own effort is fruitless, that he believes he was born with it, he's got it. But because of this belief, he avoided challenges, didn't put out effort, and most likely didn't achieve to his full potential. Now, if you had to think of an athlete to represent the growth mindset, someone who believed that their efforts were the only way to get true results, who would you think of? As many of you have probably guessed, Michael Jordan was who Dr. Carol Dweck referred to as kind of the poster child for growth mindset. Take a minute and read some of his quotes. You can see here he truly believed that if you put in the effort, if you put in the work, that the results would come. He believed that if he hadn't achieved his goal yet, the only reason would be that he needed to work harder, that he needed to focus more. You can see here he says, I can accept failure. Everyone fails at something. This means that he didn't take failure or negative criticism or negative feedback as something that was threatening. He took this as a learning experience, and he used it to propel him so that he could meet the goals of what he wanted to in the future. It's interesting that Michael Jordan is often talked about having supreme skill, talent that he was born with, that he was born to play basketball. But in interviews, he's often revealed that he was cut from his high school basketball team, that he lost championships in college. And you can see here in his quote that he's missed shots. He's lost hundreds of games. His record isn't perfect, as a lot of times he's talked about being. In Michael Jordan's eyes, he never reached perfection. He never reached a point where he didn't need to improve. This is what made him such a great athlete. When everyone else couldn't imagine how he could improve his skills, he knew he had a goal that he was working towards. He focused on mastery, and when he reached his goal, he raised the bar on himself and continued to grow and develop as an athlete. For Michael Jordan, no effort equaled no results. Michael Jordan's continued improvement throughout his career is evidence of his belief that improvement was the focus for him. Michael Jordan was quoted once as saying that he had 3 secrets to his talent on the court. Practice, practice, practice. So now that we know that we can impact our intelligence through effort, where should we focus our effort as academic learners? Last week we talked about the information processing system. This week we're going to talk about how to use our effort and understanding of the information processing model to maximize our learning. Recall the components, the 3 main components being short-term sensory store, working memory, and long-term memory. Also recall that in order to actually learn, information has to get into our long-term memory. But how does it get there? We know that we have to pay attention to information in order to bring it into our working memory, and that if we want to get it into our long-term memory and be able to retrieve it at a later time, we have to use elaboration and organization. But what does this mean for us as academic learners? It means that we need learning strategies, and it means that we need to put our effort into working smarter and not necessarily harder. Let's look at some examples of learning strategies. Some of these may be a bit familiar to you. When we're using rehearsal, we're doing strategies like copying material, underlining text as we're reading, reciting things that we're trying to memorize. When we're using elaboration, we're doing things like actively summarizing what we've just read, either in our book, in our notes, or even what we've heard in lecture. We're note-making, not just note-taking, which means that we're interacting with our notes. We're not just writing down information, but we're creating questions so that we can use them later when we're studying. These can be higher level questions or lower level questions. It's also important to answer these questions, whether it's aloud to ourselves or in a study group. We want to make sure that these questions that we're creating and answering are not only lower level questions such as the definitions of key terms, but also higher level questions. You want to ask yourself what the relationship is between the concepts that you're studying. You compare and contrast key terms, or make an evaluation and back it up with evidence that you've read. We also use organization as a learning strategy. This means that we're organizing the information that we're learning. We're selecting main ideas so that we know what the key points are. We're outlining so that we can pull out the most vital pieces of information and focus on those. We're also using representations or graphic organizers, such as the matrix that appeared in the lecture from last week. This takes the burden off of our working memory so that we can see the key points of information that we need to focus on when we're studying. We can help support transferring new information into our long-term memory when we organize it well so it's easily understandable and chunkable. Now, these different strategies are not all equal. We refer to rehearsal strategies as rote learning. and the organization and elaboration strategies as meaningful learning strategies. The key difference between these two is how active your working memory is when you're engaging in these learning strategies. You've probably already guessed that elaboration and organization are key to transferring new information into long-term memory. A lot of times we use rehearsal just to keep information in our working memory, but if we're going to use it to actually learn, we're going to have to work a lot harder than if we made sense and organized the information we're learning. Knowing the differences between rote and meaningful learning strategies is key to understanding why we sometimes forget when we think we've learned something. One of the common reasons for the problem of forgetting, or really not learning in the first place, is when students use rote learning strategies instead of meaningful strategies. They're working hard, but not necessarily using the most effective strategies they could. Many students put a lot of effort into rote learning strategies such as repetition or highlighting or underlining in their books, when they should really be focusing on meaningful learning strategies. Think about it. Just because a student is using rote learning strategies doesn't mean that they're not working hard. In fact, they're probably having to work really hard to get anything in the long-term memory at all. Simple repetition, doing rehearsal strategies, will take a lot longer and a lot more effort in order to get complicated information into long-term memory. Once it's in long-term memory, it's not guaranteed that it's going to be able to be retrieved very easily. Rote learning strategies, such as simple repetition, this keeps information in the working memory, but doesn't necessarily transfer to long-term because it's very passive. Your working memory is not having to process at a very high level, which makes it very difficult for the information to get into long-term memory or to be retrieved when it does make it in. Simple repetition and other rehearsal strategies are very effective when we're learning something very simple, such as multiplication tables or how to add or subtract simple digits. When you were learning these types of things in elementary school, rote learning, or drill and kill, as your teachers probably called it, was very effective. There's not really a whole lot of other ways that you can memorize these types of simple facts. But as college students, you're not learning simple facts. You are learning at a higher level. You need to analyze. You need to understand the relationships between concepts. You're evaluating or creating, and you're applying what you're learning. This calls for a much higher level of processing in your working memory. You need to recognize similarities and differences, construct your own personal meaning so that when you go to retrieve the information, it's easily retrievable because you've associated it with something that you already know. You need to encode using those elaboration and organization strategies. This is active learning because your working memory is having to actively process the information to call into the working memory things from your long-term memory so that they can associate with the new information that's coming in. This is very active and takes a lot of concentration. But the key here is to understand when to use which strategies and to maximize the ability of our working memory. So again, this means that we need to work smarter. A person who sits for hours and repeats key terms and rereads the chapter is working hard, which makes it all the more disappointing when they go to the test or they go to do their presentation and they have to fumble through it or they can't remember the things that they were studying the night before. For this reason, it behooves us as academic learners to put full effort into learning meaningful learning strategies so that they become tools in our toolbox that we can pull out and work smarter instead of harder. So now that we're working smarter and organizing the new information that we're learning and connecting it to prior knowledge that we already had, it should be easily accessible whenever it's needed, right? Wrong. As you've likely experienced, our memories are not without faults. Despite our best efforts, our memory is inherently flawed. Let's look at these flaws, or sins of memory, as Daniel Schachter calls them. Some of these can be avoided, but some of them cannot. The first in the group is transience. This is when we have a loss of memory or a weakening of our memory over time. For example, you may be able to remember what you had for dinner 3 nights ago, but what about 3 months ago? Unless it was a special occasion like your birthday, you probably don't remember where you were or what you had for dinner or maybe even who was sitting with you. Absent-mindedness is when we're really operating out of implicit memory. We're not fully paying attention to what we're doing. For example, maybe you were running back to your dorm to jump on your computer and send out an email that was urgent. So you flew through the door, set all your things down, ran to your computer, and turned your email on. Then you were going to go back to meet some friends for dinner, but before you walked out the door, you went to grab your keys. Unfortunately, you don't remember where you put your keys. They're somewhere in your dorm because you had to have opened the door, but you weren't paying attention to where you put them down because you were focused on getting that email out. The third sin of memory is blocking. This is when you know a piece of information, you have it in your long-term memory, you've retrieved it in the past well after you originally learned it, but for some reason at this time, you're not able to remember. For example, maybe you see a friend that you hadn't seen in a few years, and this friend you went to school with for 4 years. You see them 3 years later, and for some reason, their name is on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't remember what it is. This is known as blocking. Now, usually what happens is you walk away from the friend feeling embarrassed because you weren't able to call them by name, and 10 minutes later, boop, there it is, their name, and as soon as it comes to mind, you have to blurt it out, regardless that the person is no longer standing in front of you. The fourth sin of memory is misattribution. This is when you have a memory, but you attribute it to the wrong source. For example, you may have thought you read a story on BuzzFeed, but in fact it was one of your friends who told you the story. Suggestibility. This is when memories can be implanted as a result of leading questions or comments, maybe even suggestions when a person is trying to recall past events. For example, if a lawyer was asking a witness questions about a car accident, and they said something like, "How fast was the car going when it smashed into you?" The word smashed is going to suggest that the car is going much faster than it may have in fact been going, or it's going to put an image into the head of either the jurors or the witness that's going to say that the car was going very quick. This might actually change the memory of the witness who was in the car that was hit. Now, the witness may say that the car was traveling at a very high speed, and it may not necessarily be because the person or the witness was lying, but because the suggestion of the word smash that the lawyer used actually changed the memory that the person had. Persistence. This is when something is called from our long-term memory into our working memory without us wanting to remember it. A lot of times this happens with people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Think about a soldier who was in a war. The traumatic memories that they may have from being over at war continue to fill their working memory. They're persisting in their working memory, even though the veteran or the soldier is not trying to remember them. The last set of memory is bias. This is when our current views influence how we see the past. We edit or we rewrite our experiences. For example, if we got into an argument with one of our friends, we may have negative feelings about the entirety of our relationship. Now, when we look at these 7 sins of memory, we can actually break them into 2 separate groups. The first 3, transience, absent-mindedness, and blocking, are also known as sins of omission. The last 4 are sins of commission. With sins of omission, we fail to bring to mind a desired fact. We either lost it over time, we weren't paying attention when it happened, or we're not able to retrieve it immediately from our long-term memory. So the fact is omitted. With the second group, the sins of commission, the memory is there, the information is there, but it's somehow been changed. The source is misattributed, there has been changed because of suggestibility. It's coming into our working memory without us trying to remember it, or it's been shaped by our current feelings or views. Which of these 2 groups do you think affects us most as academic learners? If you guess sins of omission, you're absolutely right. Finally, here are some questions to help you reflect on the lecture. Do you believe you can impact your intelligence? How does this belief affect how much effort you exert? Do your actions say your effort is fruitful? Do you mainly engage in rote or meaningful learning strategies? How can you work smarter so transience plays less of a role in your ability to retrieve information from long-term memory? Don't forget to take quiz 2 before the deadline, which is 11:59 p.m. on Friday, August 29th.